The clay outside the machine shed was still holding August heat when Elaine counted out $85 in worn bills and handed them to a man who couldn't wait to be rid of the rust. The 1952 Farmall Super M sat on cinder blocks, tires flat, engine seized, paint flaked down to bare iron. It hadn't turned over since the Clinton administration. 3 miles down the county road, their modern John Deere was sitting in a shop with a blown transmission and a $4,000 estimate. Harvest was 14 days out. 320 acres of soybeans were drying in the field, and the bank had already sent the second notice. She didn't buy the tractor because she loved old iron. She bought it because the shop quote would have triggered a collateral call, and the note renewal was due on the 12th. $85 was all she could pull from the feed account without Tomas noticing. When she towed it back to the shed, the neighbors slowed down to look. Some waved. Most just shook their heads. By evening, the joke had already made it to the co-op. Matthew's girl bought a lawn ornament and called it a harvest plan. Tomas stood in the doorway that night, arms crossed, watching her scrape decades of grime off the bell housing. He didn't yell. He just asked her what she was trying to prove. She didn't answer. She couldn't. The truth was sitting right there on the workbench. A bank letter, a shop estimate, and a field that wouldn't wait for pride to get out of the way. If that engine didn't turn by September 12th, the beans would shell out in the pods, the yield would drop below the loan threshold, and the auctioneer would be standing in their driveway before frost. Have you ever watched someone you love carry debt they were too proud to talk about? What did that look like from the outside? Drop a comment. I'd like to know what you saw. She soaked the cylinders in penetrating oil, wrapped a chain around the front pulley, and pulled until her shoulders burned. Nothing, just the sound of rust holding fast. She wiped her hands on a rag, set it down, and reached for the distributor cap. The county was laughing. The bank was waiting, and inside that seized block, something was either going to break free or break her. Black Hawk County, Iowa, holds its heat long after the sun drops. By late August, the soybeans were turning from green to a pale, dusty gold, and the air smelled like dry stalks and diesel. The Matthews place had been sitting on that same quarter section since 1954, when their grandfather traded 2 milk cows and a handwritten promissory note for the first 80 acres. Their father added the rest in '89, mortgaging the house to buy the south field. He died in a combine rollover in 2012. Their mother followed 2 years later, quietly, in the upstairs bedroom that still smells like lavender and old paper. What was left was 320 acres, a 14-year operating loan sitting at $142,000, and 2 siblings who loved the land but carried it differently. Tomas, 38, kept the ledgers. He knew the interest rates, the crop insurance deadlines, the exact cost per acre of seed and chemical. He wore clean boots to the co-op and spoke in numbers because numbers felt safer than memory. Elaine, 32, knew the soil. She knew which drainage tiles wept in April, which corner of a north field held moisture longest, and how the beans sounded when they were ready to cut. She woke at 4:30, brewed coffee in a chipped enamel pot, and walked the fence line before the dew burned off. Her prayer wasn't spoken aloud. It was in the way she rested her hand on the steering wheel before turning the key, in the worn leather Bible tucked behind the seat of the grain truck, in the quiet surrender of showing up day after day when the margins kept shrinking. They ran on routine because routine kept the dread at bay. Check the moisture, grease the combine headers, call the elevator for basis quotes, patch the hydraulic line on the old truck, eat supper at 6, listen to the radio, sleep, repeat. It was a rhythm that had kept the farm alive through the '80s crash, the '12 drought, and 3 separate bank officers who all used the same polite voice to say the same tight words. But routine doesn't fix a blown transmission. And it doesn't pay a note that's 12 days from renewal. Out past the machine shed, where the gravel drive meets the county road, there's a cottonwood tree their father planted the year Elaine was born. He carved their initials into the bark when they were kids, TM plus EM, and told them the land would outlive them all if they treated it like a steward, not an owner. Elaine still walks out there in the spring to check if the carving's still visible. It's fading now, swallowed by new growth. But she goes anyway, because some things aren't about yield. They're about witness. If your family had a vote today on whether to keep or sell the farm, would everyone agree? Or would it tear something open? I read them. Inside the shed, the Farmall sat exactly where she'd left it. Silent. Heavy. Waiting. Tomas had already called a broker in Cedar Falls about listing the South 80. Elaine hadn't answered him. She just picked up a wire brush, knelt in the dirt, and started scraping rust off the manifold. The beans were drying. The clock was running. And Elaine didn't care about their disagreement. It only cared who showed up. The letter from First State AG Credit arrived on a Tuesday. Printed on heavy cream stock that felt too formal for a kitchen table covered in grease rags and seed catalogs. It wasn't a threat. It was worse. It was a reminder. The operating note, $142,000 at 6.8%, was up for renewal on September 12th. If the transmission on the Deere wasn't fixed, or if an alternative harvest plan wasn't documented and insured, the bank would trigger the collateral clause. That meant the South 80. The same 80 Tomas had already priced with a broker in Cedar Falls. The loan officer's name was printed at the bottom, David Mercer. He'd grown up 3 towns over. He knew what soybeans looked like when they shattered. He also knew the bank's risk matrix didn't care about family history. Elaine read it twice, folded it along the original crease, and slid it beneath the coffee maker. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She just walked out to the shed, pulled a 5-gallon bucket upside down beside the Farmall, and went back to work. The soybeans were down to 14% moisture. Another week of dry wind, and they'd shell out in the pods. Yield would drop below the loan threshold. The elevator would dock them 12 cents a bushel for cracked beans, and the bank would take the land before the first frost. Every hour the tractor sat silent was an hour the margin bled out. Tomas found her there at midnight. The overhead lamp was buzzing, casting a sickly yellow circle over the engine block. She was elbow deep in the cylinder head, knuckles split, grease worked so deep in her skin it looked like bruising. She hadn't eaten since breakfast. Her hands trembled when she reached for the torque wrench. He told her to stop. Told her she was going to break herself over a machine that hadn't turned over in 20 years. She didn't look up, just said the beans wouldn't wait for her to rest. He watched her wipe sweat from her jaw with a rag that was already black with oil. Her shoulders were hunched, her breathing shallow. She looked less like a farmer and more like someone holding up a collapsing roof with her bare hands that he left the shed without another word. But he didn't go to the house. He stood on the gravel drive, phone pressed to his ear, listening to the broker explain how quickly they could list the South Field if she didn't come to her senses. The conversation was quiet, practical, and entirely reasonable. That's what made it hurt. He wasn't trying to steal the land. He was trying to save what was left of it, and she was trying to save all of it. Neither of them was wrong. Both of them were running out of time. Did you ever watch someone you love work a piece of land so hard it scared you? Not just tired, I mean the kind of tired that doesn't come back. The kind that settles in the bones and stays there. Leave a comment. I want to know who you were watching. By Thursday, the penetrating oil had seeped into the rings, but the crankshaft still wouldn't budge. She rigged a chain hoist to the shed rafters, wrapped a strap around the front pulley, and pulled until her shoulders shook. Nothing, just the dead weight of 70-year-old iron refusing to yield. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the corrugated metal walls. The sky turned the color of old lead. Rain was coming. If it hit before she could get the engine free, the moisture would spike, the beans would mold, and the harvest window would slam shut. She wiped her forehead with the back of a greasy wrist, set the wrench down, and stared at the seized block. The shed was quiet except for the wind and her own breathing. Something was about to give. She just didn't know if it would be the tractor or her. The parts catalog for the Super M was buried under a stack of damp cardboard boxes in the back corner of the machine shed. Elaine moved them one by one, her boots kicking up dust that smelled like old oil and dried mouse nests. Beneath the last box sat a rusted metal filing cabinet their father had dragged home from a bankrupt implement dealer in '94. The bottom drawer was jammed. She worked a flathead screwdriver into the seam, leaned her weight into it, and the metal groaned open. Inside weren't parts invoices. They were field logs, handwritten, dated 1986, as she pulled the top ledger free. The pages were brittle, stained with coffee rings and grease thumbprints. Her father's handwriting, tight, slanted, rushed, filled the margins. Yield totals, rainfall inches, chemical costs, and then, halfway through October, a single line circled 3 times in red ink. South 80 mortgage to save the rest. Don't let them take it. Not ever. Beneath it, a second note, softer, almost an apology. Tomas was 6. He doesn't remember the auction truck. I do. Elaine sat down on an upturned bucket, the ledger heavy in her lap. She'd always thought Tomas's obsession with the numbers was just caution. She'd called it fear. She'd mocked his clean boots and his broker calls as surrender. But the logs told a different story. Their father hadn't just lost money in the '80s crash. He'd lost 300 acres to a bank officer who smiled while signing the foreclosure. He bought the South 80 back in '89 by taking a second mortgage on the house, working double shifts at the grain elevator, and sleeping 4 hours a night for 3 years straight. Tomas hadn't been protecting a spreadsheet. He'd been protecting a trauma. He'd been 10 years old when the auctioneer stood in their driveway. He remembered the sound of the gavel. He remembered their mother crying in the kitchen while strangers loaded their grandfather's tools onto a flatbed. Elaine had been 4. She only remembered the cottonwood tree and the way the land felt after they got it back. That was the fracture. Not greed. Not pride. Memory. Tomas farmed by the ledger, because the ledger was the only thing that had ever kept the bank from the door. Elaine farmed by the soil, because the soil was the only thing that had ever felt like home. Their father had carried both weights until they broke him, and now they were carrying them against each other. She turned the page. Tucked between the October and November entries was a folded sheet of dealership stationery. A mechanic's warning from 2004, addressed to their father, regarding the very John Deere that was currently sitting dead in Cedar Falls. Transmission housing shows stress fractures. Recommend full rebuild before heavy harvest load. Estimated cost, $3,800. Her father had initialed the bottom. We'll monitor. He never fixed it. He ran it until the gears stripped, passing the debt and the deadline down to them like an inheritance. The shed felt colder. The wind outside had died, leaving a heavy, still silence. Elaine traced her father's initials with a grease-blackened thumb. He hadn't left them a farm. He'd left them a choice. Fix what's breaking or watch it break you. Tomas was trying to cut the loss. She was trying to outrun it. Neither of them had asked what the land actually needed. She closed the ledger, slid it back into the drawer, and stood up. The Farmall sat 10 feet away, silent and rusted. But for the first time, she didn't see a gamble. She saw a bridge. If she could turn that engine, she wouldn't just be saving the harvest. She'd be proving that old iron could still carry new weight. That memory didn't have to dictate the future. That maybe, just maybe, they could farm without fear. She picked up a breaker bar, fitted it to the crankshaft pulley bolt, and leaned in. The metal groaned. Something deep inside the block shifted. Not much, just a fraction of an inch. But it moved. She didn't pray for a miracle. She prayed for strength to do what came next. It was just past 2 in the morning when she finally let go of the breaker bar, wiped her hands on a rag that was more oil than cotton, and walked back to the house. The kitchen was dark except for the stove clock glowing green. She filled the kettle, set it on the burner, and sat at the table with her father's old field log still open to the 1986 entry. She didn't open a Bible. She didn't need to. The words were already in her head, worn smooth from years of quiet repetition. Cast your burden on the Lord, and He will sustain you. She'd heard it at Grace Community Church every Sunday since she was 6. But tonight, it didn't feel like a promise. It felt like an instruction. The kettle whistled. She poured the water, watched the steam rise, and made a decision. She wasn't going to fight the engine alone anymore. Pride had kept her from asking for help. Fear had kept Tomas from offering it. But the land didn't care about either. She pulled her phone from her pocket, scrolled past the broker's number, and typed a single text to the only mechanic in the county who still knew how to work on a Continental 4-cylinder. Need a second set of hands on a 52 Super M. Can pay in beans or cash. Your call. She hit send before she could talk herself out of it. Then she turned off the light, rested her forehead against the cool window glass, and finally let herself breathe. Faith wasn't waiting for the rust to fall away. It was admitting she couldn't scrape it off by herself. The call from First State AG Credit came at 9:14 a.m. on a Thursday. David Mercer didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Bankers in rural Iowa don't threaten. They recite policy. He asked them to come to the Cedar Falls branch at noon. Not tomorrow. Today. When they walked into the glass-walled conference room, the air conditioning was set too cold, and the table was already laid out with 3 manila folders, a notary stamp, and a single black pen. Mercer sat at the head, sleeves rolled, tie loosened, looking less like a villain and more like a man trapped between a family he'd known since high school and a risk matrix he couldn't override, but he opened the center folder. The operating note was highlighted in yellow. The loan-to-value ratio had slipped below the bank's threshold after the county assessor's latest land valuation. The blown transmission on the deer had triggered a clause in the crop insurance policy. Without documented harvest capacity, the indemnity payout would be reduced by 40%. That left a $62,000 gap between what the beans would bring and what the note required. Mercer slid a document across the polished table. It wasn't a foreclosure notice. It was a collateral substitution agreement. The bank would grant a 30-day extension on the September 12th renewal, but only if the South 80 was formally listed for sale with a licensed broker by September 10th at 4 p.m. If the listing agreement wasn't signed and filed by then, the note would be called in full. No extensions. No appeals. Tomas didn't hesitate. He uncapped the pen. His hand hovered over the signature line, knuckles white, jaw set. He'd been preparing for this moment since he was 10 years old. To him, signing wasn't surrender. It was triage. Cut the limb to save the body. Elaine's hand came down flat on the table, stopping him. She didn't shout. She just told Mercer the Farmall would be running by Monday. That she had a mechanic coming out, that the beans would be cut before the moisture dropped below 13%. Mercer looked at her with a quiet, practiced sympathy. He said the bank couldn't underwrite a promise. They underwrote iron, acreage, and documented yield. A 70-year-old tractor sitting on cinder blocks didn't meet the collateral standard. The silence that followed was heavy enough to bend the table. Tomas stared at the paper. Elaine stared at her brother. Mercer closed the folder, aligned the edges, and told them he'd leave the room for 10 minutes. When the door clicked shut, Tomas finally spoke. His voice was low, frayed at the edges. He asked her what she wanted him to do. Let the bank take everything? Watch the auctioneer park in the driveway again? She told him she wanted him to trust her. Just once. Just for 4 days. He laughed, but it wasn't funny. It was the sound of a man who had spent his whole life building walls against the exact flood she was asking him to step into. He didn't sign. He capped the pen, pushed the chair back, and walked out. Elaine stayed seated, listening to the hum of the fluorescent lights, the distant ring of a teller's phone, the quiet tick of the wall clock. September 10th. For PM, 96 hours. The bank had drawn a line. The land was waiting, and the shed was still silent. Silas replied at dawn. 3 words, "I'll come Tuesday." But Tuesday required parts. A rebuilt Marvel Shebler carburetor. A full copper gasket set. A replacement starter ring gear. The quote from Allstate's AG Parts came to $640. Elaine didn't have it. The feed account was dry. The operating note was frozen. The only liquid asset left on the Matthews place was walking around in the south pasture. 3 registered red Angus heifers their mother had bottle raised after the 12 drought. They weren't just livestock. They were memory. They were the last living things their mother had touched before the cancer took her. She didn't ask Tomas. She knew what he'd say. He'd call it sentimental. He'd run the numbers and tell her the heifers were worth more as breeding stock next spring. But spring was a luxury they couldn't afford. September 10th was real. She backed the rusted gooseneck trailer to the pasture gate at first light, loaded the 3 heifers with a bucket of cracked corn and a quiet word, and drove 40 miles to the Waterloo Livestock Exchange. She didn't watch the bidding. She stood by the coffee urn in the back hallway, listening to the auctioneer's rapid cadence echo off the concrete walls. When the clerk handed her the check, it was for $720. Enough for the parts. Enough for Silas. Not enough to replace what she'd just let go. She was back at the shed by noon. The UPS truck had already dropped 3 heavy cardboard boxes on the dirt floor. She cut the tape with a pocket knife, pulled out the carburetor wrapped in brown paper, and set it on the workbench. That's when she heard boots on gravel. Tomas stood in the doorway, holding a shop rag and a half-empty tube of anti-seize compound. He didn't mention the heifers. He didn't mention the bank. He just walked over, picked up a socket wrench, and asked her what torque spec the head bolts called for. 80 foot-pounds, she said. He nodded, pulled a stool over, and started cleaning the bolt threads. They worked in silence for hours. The kind of silence that isn't empty, but full. Grease on knuckles, metal on metal, the rhythmic scrape of a wire brush, the slow, deliberate turn of a torque wrench clicking into place. Faith wasn't a sermon in that shed. It was 2 siblings who had spent a week pulling in opposite directions, finally putting their weight on the same rope. The sun dipped low, casting long amber rectangles across the dirt floor. The engine block was reassembled. The carburetor was mounted. The fuel lines were bled. All that was left was the flywheel, the battery, and a prayer that 70 years of rust hadn't warped the crankshaft beyond saving. September 9th, 24 hours until the broker deadline. 48 until the bank called the note. The soybeans were down at 12% moisture. The wind was picking up again. And inside the shed, Two greasy hands reached for the ignition switch at the same time. The key turned with a stiff, metallic click. The starter motor groaned, dragging the heavy flywheel through its first reluctant rotation. Nothing, just the hollow whine of a 12-volt battery fighting 70 years of compression and cold iron. Elaine let go, waited 10 seconds to save the starter. Turned it again. This time, the engine coughed, a single wet backfire that rattled the corrugated shed walls and sent a thick puff of blue smoke curling toward the rafters. Tomas stepped back, wiping his hands on a rag, his jaw tight. He didn't say it, but the set of his shoulders said enough. It's not going to catch. She adjusted the choke, primed the Marvel Chevrolet carburetor with a measured half shot of ether, and turned the key a third time. The starter dragged. Once. Twice. On the third rotation, the Continental four-cylinder caught. It didn't roar. It stumbled, sputtered, and then settled into a deep, rhythmic idle that vibrated through the packed dirt floor and up through the soles of their boots. The oil pressure gauge twitched, then climbed steadily to 40 pounds. The temperature needle crept past the cold mark and held. The exhaust note smoothed out a steady, throaty pulse that hadn't been heard on the Matthews Place since the late 90s. Elaine didn't cheer. She just rested her forehead against the cracked vinyl steering wheel and let out a breath she'd been holding for 18 days. They didn't waste time celebrating. They hooked the gravity wagon to the drawbar, backed the Farmall out into the pale afternoon light, and pointed it toward the north field. The soybeans were brittle, pods rattling in the dry September wind. Moisture was down at 12%. Another 48 hours of heat, and they'd be shattering on the stalk, docking them 12 cents a bushel at the elevator. Elaine dropped the clutch, eased into second gear, and let the old iron pull. The rear tires bit into the dry clay. The engine didn't flinch. It just worked. Steady. Predictable. Exactly what a harvest demands. Word travels fast in Black Hawk County. By noon, 3 pickup trucks were idling on the Gravel County Road. Men who joked about the lawn ornament at the co-op stood leaning against their tailgates, arms uncrossed, watching a 70-year-old tractor pull a loaded grain wagon up the slight grade without missing a beat. The broker from Cedar Falls drove past slowly, his window down, his phone resting silent on the passenger seat. Even David Mercer's silver sedan crested the hill around 2 o'clock. He didn't stop. He just slowed, watched the Farmall cut another clean pass along the fence line, noted the yield spilling into the wagon, and kept driving. No one waved. No one cheered. They just watched. And in rural Iowa, silence isn't disrespect. It's acknowledgement. The kind that comes when skepticism runs out of arguments. Tomas stood by the field gate, a moisture tester in one hand, a clipboard in the other. He watched his sister guide the tractor with the same quiet rhythm their father had used. The ledger in his pocket felt lighter. Not because the debt was gone. It wasn't. But because the fear that had dictated every decision since he was 10 years old finally had somewhere else to go. He walked out to the edge of the stubble, waited for her to circle back, and handed her a thermos of black coffee. She took it with a grease-stained hand. He didn't apologize. She didn't gloat. They just stood there, listening to the steady thrum of an engine that had refused to die, pulling a harvest that had refused to wait. September 10th came and went. The broker never got the listing agreement. The bank note rolled over on a documented harvest plan and a signed yield projection. The county didn't apologize for laughing. They didn't need to. The field spoke for itself. The last wagon rolled into the bin yard just after dusk on September 14th. The soybeans poured like dry rain, a steady cascade of pale gold that finally filled the hopper to the brim. Elaine killed the engine. The sudden silence was heavier than the noise. Her hands wouldn't unclench from the steering wheel. Her shoulders ached with a deep, bone-level fatigue that sleep wouldn't fix. 18 days of wrenching, worrying, and running on black coffee and adrenaline had left her hollowed out but standing. The harvest was in. The yield hit 42 bushels an acre. Enough to cover the operating note. Enough to keep the South 80 off the auction block. Not enough to erase the $142,000 still sitting on the bank's ledger. The cost was already tallied. The 3 red Angus heifers were gone, sold to a feedlot in Nebraska. Their mother's breeding line ended. The feed account was still dry. The Farmall's clutch was slipping, a quiet reminder that old iron can be resurrected but never made new. And Tomas was different. The fear that had lived in his posture since childhood had finally loosened its grip, replaced by a quiet, weary respect. He didn't thank her. He didn't need to. He just started showing up at the shed at dawn, coffee in hand, ready to work beside her instead of against her. The fracture hadn't vanished. It had just been bridged. Some viewers will want a miracle here. A sudden inheritance, a bank forgiveness letter, a record-breaking market price that wipes the slate clean. But that's not how the land works. And that's not how faith works. Faith didn't pay the note. Faith kept her hands on the wrench when every logical voice told her to let go. Faith kept Tomas from signing the listing agreement when terror screamed that he should. Faith was the quiet endurance that outlasted the drought, the debt, and the doubt. The farm wasn't saved by a windfall. It was saved by sacrifice. And sacrifice always leaves a mark. She climbed down from the tractor, boots hitting the packed dirt with a dull thud. The evening air was cool, carrying the first real hint of autumn. Frost would come soon. The fields would go bare. The ledger would reset, and they would do it all again next spring. Not because it was easy, but because the land was still theirs. Because the cottonwood tree was still standing. Because some things are worth carrying even when they're heavy. She walked to the edge of the bin yard, looked out over the darkened stubble, and finally let herself rest. The county had stopped laughing. The bank had backed off. The harvest was secure. But the real victory wasn't in the yield. It was in the quiet truth that they had faced the breaking point together and chosen to hold on. The Matthews place didn't get a miracle. It got a harvest. The banknote rolled over. The South 80 stayed in the family. The Farmall still runs, though the clutch slips a little harder every spring. Tomas keeps the ledgers. Elaine walks the fence line. Some mornings, they still don't agree. But they don't stand on opposite sides of the shed anymore. They stand on the same dirt, looking at the same sky, carrying the same weight. That's not a fairy tale. That's just what survival looks like when pride finally bows to purpose. Faith didn't erase the debt. It just gave them the strength to face it without breaking each other. Sometimes that's all it does. Sometimes it doesn't part the waters. It just keeps you walking while they're still rising. And for a lot of families out there, that's enough. Not because it's easy, but because the land is still there. The name is still on the mailbox. And the work continues. I want to ask you something before you go. Not about tractors or banknotes. About the quiet cost of holding on. What's the one thing your family refused to let go of, even when everyone said it was time? Was it a field? A house? A promise? A way of doing things that didn't make sense to anyone but you? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you're carrying something heavy right now, a deadline, a disagreement, a debt you haven't told anyone about, you're not alone. This channel exists for you. The harvest ends. The ledger resets, but the land remembers who stayed. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.